All right, so let's think about this chapter, and that is chapter 21, and regarding children born not totally depraved, but born innocent and pure. So here is the doctrine, and I want to say that this doctrine is really the foundation of all denominationalism, basically, more or less. But it is really an unspoken word with many people. That is, they accept it, they believe it, they don't necessarily get up and teach it straightforwardly, they just kind of cover it up a little bit. But this is the basis of the doctrine, which also has bled out into other doctrines that it has come to other places, such as infant baptism, as we'll see in just a moment. But let's just think about it, and that is total depravity, which is said total hereditary depravity. This was the system that was furthered by John Calvin in the 16th century. John Calvin began with this, and that is that people are born totally depraved. Depraved, that is, they can't do anything good at all, and that comes from birth, and that comes from your parents, that it comes directly from your parents. So here's how it is stated. This is the first paragraph on 154. Webster says, hereditary means transmitted or transmissible as a constitutional quality or condition from parent to offspring. Depravity means the state of being evil, perverted, and corrupted. So the theory is that from childhood or from birth, actually from conception, children are born in sin. Now his next point is one that is well taken, and that is one sin or one error leads to another, and this is exactly what's going to take place here. So the doctrine of hereditary total depravity led to erroneous doctrine of infant baptism. So John Wesley, this I think is so telling, the founder of the Methodist Church, this is in order. And by the way, that's how they put it in the Methodist Manual. John Wesley founded our church. He's the founder of the church. Quote, the grand question is, who are the proper subject of baptism? Grown persons only or infants also? In order to answer this fully, I shall first lay down the grounds of infant baptism, taken from Scripture, reason, and primitive universal practice, and secondly, answer objections against it. As to the grounds of it, the infants are guilty of original sin. Then they are the proper subjects of baptism, seeing in the ordinary way they cannot be saved unless this be washed away by baptism. It has already been proved that this original stain cleaves to every child of man, and that thereby they are children of wrath, liable to eternal damnation. Infants need to be washed from original sin, therefore they are proper subjects of baptism. The church historian Neander also states that infant baptism originated from the doctrines of original sin, which came about in the 3rd and 4th centuries, particularly with Augustine in the 4th century, that people are born in sin. Let's just kind of go back and analyze that comment that Wesley made here. What did he say about baptism? First of all, that's pretty interesting. You have to think about this for a moment. What did he say about baptism? That's pretty interesting. We'll see how this goes in just a moment. Washes away sin. Baptism washes away sin. Why did they insist that children be baptized? Because they're born in sin, to wash away sin. Correct. Totally depraved, child of the devil, cannot do good, cannot think good, cannot do anything good at all until you have a direct operation of the Spirit moves on you. But the point simply is this, that Wesley himself recognized that historically baptism was for the remission of sins, washing away sins. So if children are born in sin, what are we going to do with the children? Baptize them. That's what has to be the case. That's where infant baptism came from. But they didn't do it by immersion. So how did they do it? Sprinkling and pouring. So how did that come about, sprinkling and pouring? So let's think about this for a moment. Let's just leave that strand of history here for a moment. Let's just come over here. How did sprinkling and pouring come about as a substitute for immersion? How did that originate? We talked about this in the church history class before. How did that begin? That's correct. For those who could not be immersed in water, they were on their sick bed, for example, and so they said, well, in clinic, and they called it clinical baptism. In clinical cases only, this would be in the end of the 2nd century, early 3rd century era. In clinical cases only, the churches said, we will allow people to be sprinkled for baptism. But that is not what the practice is or has been from the New Testament. But we'll allow it in clinical cases because they're on the sick bed and the deathbed and they may not be able to get up, so we'll allow it that way. Well, what obviously came about? Well, what comes about? It just comes about, what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. So if you can do it for one person, you can do it for all. If it's valid baptism, then you can do it for all. In the New Testament time, what the point simply is that it is recognized, and all church historians recognize it, as well as the denominational manuals. Number one, that baptism was for the remission of sins, and number two, it was by immersion. That's what it was for, and that's how it was done. But that is how it was changed due to the different ideas. So let's think about the hereditary depravity. Anything to mention on that particular? We'll think about that for a moment. Yes, ma'am. The Roman Church adopted it from early centuries, such as the 3rd and 4th centuries. They adopted it because once it became engrafted in common practice, it's very, very difficult to reverse yourself. And so even though the first pope was not crowned until 606 AD, they had already been practicing sprinkling for baptism from the 4th century forward, even though that is now the 7th century. So they have been practicing that. They have been taught that people are born in sin, and we're sprinkling these babies. So that's where it came from. It was a change in the doctrine of the church, and that's what happened. That's how it happened. Yes, sir. Well, if you accept original sin, that people are born in sin, how do you cleanse that sin? If baptism is recognized as for the remission of sins, and a child is born in sin, what are you going to have to do? Well, you have to baptize him, but they're going to sprinkle that baby instead. So let me give you the illustration. I've talked about it before, just to kind of focus our minds on it. Even in early America, in the 19th century, the Baptist church taught that people, and still do actually, but they were very plain about it, very outspoken, that children are born in sin. They would not necessarily, therefore, baptize the babies because they said, no, baptism is actually by immersion. So they didn't baptize them, but the doctrine was very plain and simple, and Raccoon John Smith was one of those Baptist preachers who said, we don't know whether children who die in infancy, if they're saved or lost. They may be lost. God may save them by his grace, but he said they're born in sin. So if that be the case, when he was in Alabama, his farm burned, his house burned, and he and his wife Nancy were away taking care of the sick. It's really sad story. And someone said, your house is on fire. He had a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, a 7-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl, and they died in fire. And so he was, of course, devastated. They lost all their possessions. His wife, Nancy, she could never get over it. She died within 3 months. She just, a broken heart. And he buried all his family right there in Alabama. But he began to struggle with one question, and that was, my children, are they damned? They died in a fire. Are they going to go to the eternal fire now? He just could not hardly accept that. So he went back to Kentucky, from whence he had come, and he stood up at a camp meeting, and he was all poor, and his clothes were ragged. They asked him, oh, John Smith, you're back. And he said, why don't you stand up and preach? So it was a big camp meeting. He stood up to preach. And then as he started to preach, he said, brethren, something is wrong. I don't know what it is. I can't find out what it is, but he said, until I can find out what's wrong here, I said, I don't. And he sat down. Started to preach and something's not right. Something is just not right. Well, it was later that he saw copies of Alexander Campbell's paper, The Christian Baptist. And he was so overjoyed because Campbell says the whole doctrine of hereditary total depravity is not taught in the Bible. People are not born in sin at all. that was just like not only a light coming on, but it was just relief, because his own children who had died in the fire, he recognized that they were innocent and pure, and they're not bound to a devil's hell. So that's how he came to it, by personal experience, and it's kind of a sad experience. So in those days, though, that's how it was taught. It was taught, and they taught it straightforward, right out of the Baptist pulpit. Children are born in sin. Some of them are going to be going to hell. Well, we don't do that today, but the Baptist Creed reads exactly the same. The same today as it did then. They don't mash on that. All right, so comments on that. We haven't talked about Bible verses yet, but just thinking about the issue to set it in context. Anything? Yes, sir, Roger. What is the age of accountability? I suppose it differs from individual to individual. I'm going to suggest that. Go ahead. I think that's a good answer. If you didn't hear him, he said when you know the difference between right and wrong, and you know also why it's wrong and what God wants you to do. But I will say this. I have found it very challenging in the churches of Christ, bringing up children, and you teach them the facts, and what do they want to do when they're like 5 and 6 and 7 years old? They want to be baptized. I've had some children come 11 years old to be baptized, and I say, well, I would go to the back room. I say, why do you want to be baptized? Well, I want to take the Lord's Supper. Well, it's okay. You know what? Let me go get your mom and dad for just a moment. Let's just talk about this. And I just come out and say, look, we're going to talk to this person. But I had one say, he said, well, I want to be a Christian. I said, well, let me ask you this question. He was like 10 years old. I said, if you died right now, would you go to be with Jesus, or you would go to be with the devil? I just put it that way. He said, I'd go to be with Jesus. I said, well, let me talk to your mom and dad for a few moments. And so I you know what? He does not understand. It's just, we were told here, Landon mentioned it, he doesn't understand the difference in right and wrong and the condemnation that comes with sin. And so that being the case, I hesitate to baptize children. I remember Austin McGarry, an old-time preacher, would say, we are not in the business of baptizing children. This is not about children. We're in the business of baptizing people who are in sin, who recognize they're in sin. So it is very difficult because we train our children and they know the answers. So I ask my sons, the kids when they're 7 years old, they know the answers to all the questions. They know the answers. They listen to me preach. They hear everybody talking about it. They know the answers, but that doesn't mean they really understand the significance of what's going on here. That's just my take on it. You might have a different thought. And see, right there, I do not like saying no to when they want to be baptized. Don't say no. No, I never did that. I said, you know what? Let's study some more, and just I try to deflect it just a little bit, because I don't like crunching their desire to become a Christian, even if I'm suspicious that they. Right? Yeah. There are a lot of reasons. That's right. That's right. There are a lot of reasons people do that, and I'm glad to bring them in the Lord's church and under the tutelage of the gospel, but we do need to be careful not to baptize children. All right, so having said that, let's just look at a couple of statements here. This is an examination of proof texts. And so your Old Testament, this is Psalms 14. We'll go to Psalm 51, Psalm 58. Let's go to Psalm 14. So these are several of what are called proof texts. These are texts supposedly teach that we can baptize children. This first one is 14, 2 and 3. Actually, I have it right here. It's right here written in the text. One of you read it out, if you will. Okay? Let's think about that for a moment. The portion of the passage that is emphasized by those who are infant baptizers and believers in total depravity is, there's none that doeth good, no, not so much as one. So they really push on that. Of course, that is exactly what the text says. However, we're told in the very text how that came about, and that would be what? They have all turned aside. They have together become unprofitable. That's the way Paul quotes it also in the book of Romans chapter 3. They have turned aside. They have together become unprofitable. People are not born unprofitable. They become unprofitable. They turn aside. So there's an important text. That's Romans 3, verses 10 through 12. That's a quotation from Psalm 14. You might check me on that, Romans 3, 10 through 12, and see if exactly that's what it says. All right, let's go to the next text, unless there's something you want to mention on that one. Let's look at on the way by. This is Psalm 51 and 5. This next one, Psalm 51 and 5. All right, someone of you read that. Here we have it. This is King James right here. Now, I'm going to warn you right here. There have been a lot of misunderstandings and sometimes mistranslations of this text, and we'll see how that goes in just a moment. Yes, sir, verse 5. What translation do you read from? Okay, all right, go ahead. Okay, I want you to, let's see what it says here. I was brought forth in iniquity and in sin did my mother conceive me. You know, in my estimation, he is referring simply, as he does in 58 and 3, they're all born lying, as he tells us down here. They're wicked, estranged from the tomb. They go astray as soon as they are born, speaking lies. It's simply an hyperbole. That's my understanding of the text. That's how I understand it. That is to say, it's a wicked world into which we're born. However, the NIV, which I don't say don't use it, but I say right here, we better be very careful because the NIV reads it differently, and it has been inserted or actually twisted just a little bit in order to further the doctrine of total hereditary depravity. So anybody have an NIV? Okay, read out in the NIV what it says. Yeah. So you see, we have there, I was sinful from the time of my birth. I was sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Well, that's a little different rendition than we have in the Old King James or English Standard or ASV that I use. In sin did my mother conceive me, I was brought forth in iniquity. And I take it as referring to simply the world of iniquity, but it certainly does insert the idea that is born in sin in Psalm 51 and 5. So this is one reason Brother Fort E. Wallace wrote a book review of the NIV right here because of this verse. Said this verse and several others like it that really absolutely insert the idea of total depravity into the text. But it doesn't say I was born in sin. It just says I was born in iniquity. That is to say, in the world of iniquity, brought forth in iniquity, and sin did my mother conceive me. I take it as the world, but the world is in sin, and it is a sinful world into which he's born. But that text, in my estimation, Psalm 51 and 5, the NIV, makes it that I'm the sinner from my mother's birth. And that's how many people take it. I'm a sinner from my mother's birth. So now this is how Leroy Brownlow handles it. Those who advocate hereditary total depravity infer that David was born a sinner, but the passage is not even susceptible to that interpretation. Sin is mentioned in the verse, but it was committed before David existed. David did not exist when he was conceived. Hence, the iniquity and the sin spoken of existed before David's existence. That is, it's a world of sin, and that's how I take it to be. He probably explains it better than I do, but I take it a hyperbole. It's a sinful, sinful world is how he's putting it. All right, comments, thoughts on it? I don't know, what do you think, Dan, on that one? Kind of a tough passage, isn't it? And I'm not trying to get you to set aside the NIV. I'm just, all translations have some weaknesses in them. Yeah, he himself is full of sin. And that is how I do not believe the text reads, but at any rate, yeah. So that's a Psalm 51 and 5. That's one that you have to be careful with. So sometimes, and matter of fact, we'll see a couple of passages that overturn that concept completely. Yes, Sherry? Well, all right. So there are several issues you've kind of opened the can on that one. No, that's fine. That's fine. All right, so, all right, let's just start with the idea that you're born in sin. And that is the doctrine that is taught in denominationalism coming from Catholicism, which actually was adopted from Augustine, period. Okay. If that be the case, then the question is, how is it that Mary did not pass her sin on to Jesus? Well, so how did that happen? So they come up with another doctrine, and that is the Immaculate Conception. That is, so she herself was free from sin. So they say, okay, they have to take it back a generation further. She herself was conceived without sin. So that's how they have to do it. So that doctrine in Roman Catholicism comes about because we can't have Christ having sin from the time he was born, inherited from his mother. So his mother had to have been born free from sin too. Well, that's true. That's right. There's no Immaculate Conception. That's why I said they invented the doctrine in order to answer some of the problems that come along the way. Here's something else to think about. The proof of it that we are told consistently by denominational individuals, the Baptist church or whatever. By the way, all of these doctrines are taught in the denominationalism. I say these things because I want us to know that the Lord's church is distinctive. We want to follow the Bible only, and we're not taught that we're born as sinners from the birth. But at any rate, they are teaching that in different churches. So Baptists say, okay, here's a proof that you're born in sin because you sin. Okay, so let's just take that all the way back. Okay, because we're in sin, that proves that you're born in sin. Adam and Eve sinned the first time they were tempted. But we're told in Luke chapter 3, the last verse, that Adam was the son of God. But he sinned the first time he was tempted. You can't do worse than Adam. You can't do worse than Eve, can you? First temptation came along, as far as the record is concerned, she sinned. So if sin proves you're born in sin, what does that say about their conception or their creation? Yes, sir. I saw that. Yeah, that's a good point. And when I did a series on James some years ago, I called that segment the anatomy of sin. Here's the anatomy of sin. Here's how sin works. And it comes about because we're drawn away by our own lust and enticed, as you put it, as you read. So here's something else to think about. Let's just look at a passage in 1 John. Let's just look at a couple of them very quickly. This is 1 John chapter 2, and we'll look at 1 John chapter 3, because it gets into what exactly is sin. What is sin? And it just, like you described right there, the anatomy of sin. But here's another explanation of it from John's letter, 1 John, and this is chapter 3. But I want to start here in chapter 2 and verse 29. So look at 1 John 2:29. If you know that he is righteous, you know that everyone who doeth righteousness is begotten of him. So what is righteousness? What is doing right? Doing right is righteousness. On the other hand, therefore, now, he's setting you up for what is sin. He tells us, verse 4 of chapter 3, everyone that doeth sin, doeth lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness, that is acting outside the law of God. Sin is acting outside the law. That's the definition of sin. It is not something with which you're born. So you do righteous, you're righteous by doing righteous. And also, you sin when you do sin. It's not something with which you're born. Now, having looked at these passages, some teach, such as in the Baptist Creed, well, you're born with the proclivity to sin. You're proclaimed, that is, you receive from your parents the proclivity, the tendency to sin. But once again, it goes back to the same thing with Adam and Eve. What was their proclivity to sin? It was simply that they're free moral agents, and they were tempted, and the passage that you read shows that they're tempted, drawn away by their own lust, and enticed. So that's something to consider. Any other? Yes, sir, Randy? Randy, then Ray. Yeah, okay, Psalm 58 and 3. So this is bottom of page 156, the next one. So here's the passage. From the womb they are born speaking lies. Is he speaking literally? No, people are not speaking lies. He is speaking in hyperbole. That's why I said 51 and 5 is hyperbole. The same thing as this one, 58 and 3. People are not born speaking lies. He's simply decrying the sinful world in which we live. And it seems like everybody is lying. And that's what he's actually pointing out here in 58 and 3. All right, Ray? Well, sin can be a noun, it can be a verb, yeah. Okay, sin can be a noun, can be an action. I can sin, that would be I sin, that's verb. But there is sin, which is, and that's 1 John 3, it is lawlessness. Well, what is that? It is acting, that is defined as acting outside the boundaries of God's word. That's right, but that's the word sin. That's right, it's an action that we do. That's correct, yeah. Yes, sir, Randy? Oh, well, it may have been. Maybe he's speaking about different rulers. So let's look at passages on the next page, page 157, that show that this is not the case. And these passages, in my estimation, make it exceedingly clear that we are not born in sin. So the first one is Genesis chapter 8, verse 21. Jehovah said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground anymore for man's sake, for that the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. It's evil from his youth, at his young years. It's not about born that way, but it's evil from his youth. Here's another one, Ecclesiastes 12 and 7. You can just look on this page here, and it has several of them. We're going to Acts 17, 28, if you want to look ahead. Then we'll look at Ezekiel 18 and 20, which I think is pretty profound statement, actually, Ezekiel 18 and 20. This one is Ecclesiastes 12 and 7. The dust returns to earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. So if God gives man his spirit, and that's a corrupted spirit, then from whence did it come? God. That is very, very difficult for people to understand how possibly that could be. All right, let's think about Acts 17. Acts 17, 28, Paul is preaching to the Athenians, and he says, anybody have their Bible open to that one? Well, here it is right here on this page, so we'll just read it. Paul said to the people at Mars Hill, we are the offspring of God. So being the offspring of God, how could it possibly be conceived that we are born in sin? Oh, in the James passage, James 1, about the anatomy of sin. Yeah, right. That's correct. Now, that's important for us to know. What happened that night does not let's say someone was conceived in adultery or fornication. Does that child bear the sin of the father and mother? No, that's a pure and innocent child. So here's a passage that just establishes it beyond a shadow of a doubt, if those others have not. Not only are we all the offspring of God, but look at this one. Let's just spend a few moments here. This is Ezekiel 18 and 20. Ezekiel 18 and 20. Now, as we press along the way, just turn to the text and look at it carefully. As we turn to the text, I want you to know I'm thinking about, after we finish this book, to do a class on Ezekiel. I wrote a book on Ezekiel several years ago, and I have a lot of class books, so I thought we can use those books. We'll study the book of Ezekiel. It'll be a different class. It's not quite this first principles, but at any rate, Ezekiel 18's in it, and that's where we are, Ezekiel 18. If you have a thought on that, then I'm happy to hear you on it. Okay, so what is the issue in taking place in Ezekiel's day? The issue is Ezekiel is a prophet in captivity. He's in Babylonian captivity. And the Jewish people who are around him were saying, they had the proverb, they said, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and our children's teeth are set on edge. That is to say, we're suffering because of our father's sins. That is, we are here because our father sinned. In other words, it's not our fault, but our fathers have sinned and we are here. Isn't it hard for people to accept the responsibility for their own sins? It's exactly what's taking place in Ezekiel. And he says, That is not true. You're not suffering for your father's sins. You're suffering for your own sins. And here's how he puts it. The soul that sins, it shall die. The son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. The righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. That is, there is no transference of guilt or righteousness to any other person. For those who think that it's transferred guilt, how about transferred righteousness, what he just said here? Are your children born righteous, not needing baptism when they come of age because you're a Christian? No. They're born holy and pure, that's true, but they are themselves righteous when they do righteousness. That's what makes a person righteous. Righteousness is justification, being justified before God. Children are holy and pure, but they're righteous when they do righteousness. Not because your mom is righteous, not because your dad is righteous. I'm not going to stand at the last day with my mother beside me saying, I am Mary Sue's son. But that's the same thing, the shoe on the other foot here when people look at it. Well, all right, sin by the parents transfers to the children. No, it does not. No, it does not. No matter what sin is, no matter what sin it is about which they're conceived. Yes, ma'am. You know, going back to what we talked about at the first of class, she mentioned, was that Danny? Carrie, 9 years old. You know what? Every person has to make the decision on their own. Every family, every child, whether that child knows what they're doing. But I know, this is just me, I know that my children can answer all the questions correctly. They can answer those questions at 6 and 7 years old. Why? Because I had sat at the table with them, got them up at 4:30 and 5 o'clock in the morning and sat there with Bible study. That's what I did. I got them up at 5 in the morning and I had a Bible study at the table with my children before they went to school. I sure did. They knew the answers. And my oldest son, Seth, knew the answers when he was 7 years old. He knew exactly what to say. 6 years old, he wanted to be baptized. But I made the decision. I said, you are, I didn't say you're not ready. I simply said, let's study. So I would say, well, let's talk about it here. If you were lost or if you die, would you be with Jesus or would you be with the devil? And he would think he'd be with Jesus. I knew he'd have to. So I have to ask those questions because I know they get the answers right. But you have to ask those kind of questions sometimes to say, well, you know what? I don't think he's ready. And I didn't want to just say no and throw cold water on him. But so I put it off. And finally, he was like 11. But I tell you, when it was 7 years old, they knew the answer. All of them did. Well, I wasn't going to baptize my babies. I wasn't going to do that. I just said, no, I'm not going to do that. So every family has to make the decision on their own how to handle those situations. But that was just how I handled it. All right, Dan? Yeah, that's right. And every person is individual, and we have to, as parents, make those decisions, and we try to guide them in the best way that we can. I don't always do it right. I may have been wrong about some of those things. I don't know, but I thought, boy, I tell you what, this is going to be tough. He's 7 years old and say, I want to be baptized. I'm like, well, Ray, I've heard about those stories many, many times. So that's why I say everybody has to make the decision on their own. But at the same time, I don't want to make a mockery of baptism by baptizing someone who doesn't know anything about it. And that's the real, that I'm in sin. I'm lost if I die now. Jan. Well, you know what? And I don't know how to handle all those situations. And I think every parent probably has to make their own way through it. That's all I know to say. So, all right. Thank you for your participation in that. I know that was, maybe we can pick it up right there next week if you have something to say on it or differences, objections, however you want to do it. Okay. Thank you for your participation.